Imagine driving through a quiet American town as the sun begins to set. The streets look ordinary: small shops, neat houses, a calm sky fading into dusk. Yet something feels wrong. Conversations stop when you walk by. Eyes follow you a second too long. No one says a word, but the message is unmistakable. You are not welcome here after dark. This is the reality behind what were known as Sundown Towns, communities across the United States that systematically excluded black people and other minorities. Using intimidation, social pressure, and local policies to make sure they disappeared by nightfall. This was not ancient history. This was not limited to one region. And most disturbingly, this story is not fully over. Sundown towns were never just about geography. They were about control, about deciding who belonged and who did not. Some towns made their rules obvious. Others enforced them quietly, through unspoken threats, selective law enforcement, or housing practices that left no room for diversity. Over time, these places built reputations so powerful that people learned to avoid them without ever seeing a sign. Many Americans grow up believing that racial exclusion ended with civil rights laws. But the truth is more complicated. The legacy of Sundown Towns still shapes where people feel safe, where they travel freely, and where fear silently follows them. What happens when history is never fully confronted? What happens when silence replaces accountability? In this video, we are going to uncover the hidden story of Sundown Towns, where they came from, how their influence still lingers today, and why understanding this past matters more than ever. This is not about blaming. It is about awareness, truth, and learning how history leaves shadows that stretch far into the present. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you do not miss what comes next. Because understanding the past is the first step toward making sure it never controls the future again. When people first hear about Sundown Towns, many instinctively imagine them as a phenomenon tied only to the Deep South, a relic of one region's troubled past. Yet as we move deeper into this story, that assumption begins to fall apart. The reality is far more unsettling. These towns were not confined to a single corner of the country, nor were they limited by climate or culture. They spread quietly across the American landscape, embedding themselves in places often described as ordinary, peaceful, or even progressive. From the rolling farmland of the Midwest to small communities along the West Coast, Sundown Towns became a national pattern rather than a regional exception. After the collapse of Reconstruction, the promise of freedom for formerly enslaved people existed mostly in theory. Across the country, white communities responded to social change with fear and resistance, seeking ways to preserve control without always relying on formal laws. In the South, segregation became codified through Jim Crow statutes. But outside the region, exclusion often took subtler forms. Towns learned that they did not need state legislation to keep certain people out. Social pressure, selective enforcement of local rules, and coordinated silence could achieve the same result. Over time, these unwritten systems proved just as powerful as any official policy. In the Midwest, Sundown Towns often emerged in places shaped by rapid industrial growth or agricultural wealth. As black families migrated north and west in search of opportunity, many encountered invisible barriers that redirected them elsewhere. A town might present itself as open and lawful by day, yet transform after sunset into a space governed by unspoken expectations. People learned quickly which roads to avoid, which gas stations not to stop, and which communities were safest to pass through without drawing attention. The absence of diversity in these towns was not accidental. It was carefully maintained over generations. Further west, the myth of the frontier as a land of freedom and reinvention masked similar practices. In states often associated with opportunity and progress, exclusion took root behind friendly fades. Housing practices, employment networks, and local customs quietly reinforced racial boundaries, ensuring that certain groups never truly settled or stayed. Over time, these places developed reputations that traveled faster than any written warning. Stories were passed down within families, shaping travel routes and life decisions long before digital maps existed. What united these towns was not a single law or shared ideology, but a common goal: control over who belonged. This mindset was deeply influenced by the racial hierarchies that defined the post-Reconstruction era, when progress for some was perceived as loss for others. Jim Crow segregation may be most closely associated with the South, but its logic separation, restriction, and exclusion found expression nationwide. The difference was in presentation. In many northern and western towns, the absence of explicit rules created plausible deniability, allowing communities to deny responsibility while maintaining the same outcomes. As we connect this chapter of the story to what came before, a clearer picture begins to emerge. The tension felt by travelers at sunset, the silent warnings conveyed through stares or sudden attention from authority figures, and the generational memory of where it was safe to exist did not appear by chance. They were the result of decades of collective behavior shaped by fear, silence, and historical choices. Understanding that sundown towns were a national phenomenon forces us to confront a deeper truth. The boundaries of exclusion in America were drawn far beyond the lines most people expect, and their influence continues to shape the present in ways that are still unfolding today. As the story moves forward in time, one detail becomes impossible to ignore. The signs are gone, but the message often remains. The wooden warnings that once marked town borders have been taken down, and the open declarations that told people when to leave no longer hang in public view. On the surface, these places appear indistinguishable from countless other American towns, calm and ordinary, shaped by routine rather than fear. Yet beneath that appearance, the systems that once enforced exclusion did not simply vanish. They adapted, becoming quieter, more difficult to trace, and in many ways more effective because they no longer announce themselves. What replaced the obvious rules was a network of subtle signals and structural barriers. Housing became one of the most powerful tools. In towns shaped by decades of exclusion, rental applications suddenly filled up, mortgages became mysteriously unavailable, and zoning rules quietly limited who could live where. These policies were rarely explained in terms of race, yet their outcomes followed a familiar pattern. Neighborhoods remained unchanged not because of coincidence, but because the pathways into them were carefully narrowed. To an outsider, the process looked bureaucratic and impersonal, but to those affected, it felt deliberate and deeply personal. Policing also took on a new role in reinforcing these boundaries. Instead of enforcing curfews, officers began to rely on discretion. Minor infractions received outsized attention. Traffic stops became more frequent, and questions lingered longer than necessary. None of this needed to be written down to be understood. The presence of authority, applied unevenly, sent a clear signal about who belonged and who was being watched. Over time, these encounters shaped reputations, spreading through word of mouth and shared experience rather than official records. Zoning laws and local ordinances added another layer to this quiet transformation. Rules about property size, land use, or rental restrictions were often framed as efforts to preserve community character or maintain order. Yet the effect was consistent with the past, limiting access and discouraging change. These measures gave towns a language that sounded neutral while producing outcomes that mirrored older forms of exclusion. By the time these patterns became visible in demographic data, they were already deeply entrenched. What makes this chapter of the story especially unsettling is how easily it blends into everyday life. Unlike the past, there is rarely a single moment that confirms what a place truly is. Instead, awareness builds gradually through small interactions. Uncomfortable silences, and the sense of being observed rather than welcomed. People learn to trust their instincts, to read between the lines, and to leave before the atmosphere shifts from uneasy to threatening. The decision to move on is often framed as personal choice, even when it is shaped by an environment that quietly pushes certain people away. When placed alongside the history already explored, this evolution feels less like change and more like continuity. The methods have become less visible, but the purpose remains familiar. Control has given way to compliance, force to pressure, and public declarations to private enforcement. By understanding how these towns transformed rather than disappeared, the story gains a new clarity. It reveals that the absence of signs does not mean the absence of barriers, and that the legacy of Sundown Towns continues not through loud declarations, but through systems that operate best when they are rarely questioned and seldom named. As the quiet systems of exclusion continued to evolve, their effects became most visible in the lives of the people who encountered them firsthand. The history of these towns is not preserved only in records or statistics, but in personal memories carried by travelers and families who learned, sometimes abruptly, that certain places were not meant for them. These modern experiences form a bridge between the past and the present, revealing how old patterns still shape everyday movement, opportunity, and emotional safety. For many Black travelers, the sense of unease begins long before anything openly happens. It can start with the sudden awareness of being the only person who looks different in a restaurant, a store, or a gas station. Conversations pause, glances linger, and a simple stop that was meant to last minutes feels longer than it should. Nothing is said aloud, yet the atmosphere communicates caution. People describe a growing tension that is difficult to explain to someone who has never felt it, a feeling that encourages quick decisions and quiet exits rather than confrontation. Attempts to settle in these towns often bring a different kind of clarity. Prospective residents describe enthusiasm turning into confusion as applications stall, phone calls go unanswered, or opportunities vanish without explanation. What appears on the surface to be bad timing or simple miscommunication slowly begins to resemble a pattern. Stories circulate of homes that were suddenly no longer available or jobs that quietly disappeared after an in-person meeting. Over time, these experiences teach a painful lesson about where effort is welcomed and where it is quietly resisted. Encounters with local authority frequently intensify these impressions. Traffic stops that seem routine on paper can feel loaded in context, especially when they occur repeatedly without clear cause. Questions stretch longer than necessary, and attention feels focused in a way that others in the same space do not experience. These moments leave lasting impressions, not only because of what happens, but because of what might have happened. The uncertainty itself becomes part of the burden, shaping decisions about whether to stay, return, or pass through without stopping again. What connects these personal accounts to the earlier history is their consistency. These are not isolated incidents, but recurring themes shared across regions and generations. Parents pass down advice about safe routes and places to avoid, just as earlier generations once did. Technology may have changed how people travel, but caution still guides many of the same choices. The stories differ in detail, yet echo a familiar message. Safety is not guaranteed everywhere, and awareness remains essential. Placed within the broader narrative, these experiences reveal how the legacy of exclusion persists without needing to announce itself. The fear described by modern travelers does not come from imagination, but from accumulated knowledge shaped by real encounters. It reflects an understanding that history did not simply end, but adapted, leaving behind environments where belonging is still conditional. By listening to these voices, the story of Sundown Towns becomes more than a historical account. It becomes a living reminder that the past continues to shape the present, not through laws written in plain sight, but through moments that quietly tell people where they are and are not meant to be. As the experiences of travelers and residents accumulate over time, the true weight of Sundown Towns becomes clearer. Their impact does not end at the town line or fade once a person leaves the area. Instead, it settles into the mind, shaping how people move through the world and how they imagine their place within it. What began as localized practices of exclusion gradually evolved into long-term consequences that reach far beyond any single encounter, leaving marks that are emotional, social, and economic. The psychological effects are often the most immediate and the hardest to measure. Living with the awareness that certain places are unsafe or unwelcoming creates a constant state of vigilance. For many, travel requires careful planning, mental checklists, and contingency routes that others never have to consider. Over time, this heightened awareness can turn into chronic stress, shaping how people perceive new environments and unfamiliar faces. Even when nothing overt happens, the memory of past encounters lingers, reinforcing the instinct to stay alert, to leave early, or to avoid certain areas altogether. This quiet burden is rarely visible to outsiders, yet it deeply influences everyday life. Restricted mobility follows naturally from this emotional reality. When entire towns or regions are known, through shared stories and experience, to be places of risk, movement becomes limited. Families choose longer routes to avoid passing through certain areas. Job opportunities are weighed not only by salary or growth, but by the safety of the surrounding community. Education, work, and travel decisions are shaped by boundaries that never appear on maps, yet are widely understood by those who navigate them. Over generations, these invisible borders narrow the spaces in which people feel free to exist without fear. The economic consequences of this restricted movement are profound. Property ownership has long been one of the most reliable paths to stability and wealth in America. When communities are effectively closed off, families lose access to appreciating assets, quality schools, and local networks that support long-term success. Being excluded from certain housing markets decades ago did not only affect one generation, it reshaped the financial trajectories of those who followed. Opportunities missed in the past compound over time, creating gaps that are difficult to close even when formal barriers are removed. As these patterns repeat, inequality becomes self-reinforcing. Towns that remained closed off often stagnated, while families pushed into limited areas faced overcrowding and fewer resources. The result was not just separation, but imbalance, with some communities accumulating advantages while others were systematically denied them. This imbalance was never accidental. It grew out of choices made and sustained over many years, choices that favored exclusion over inclusion and silence over accountability. When viewed alongside the modern stories of fear and exclusion, the legacy of Sundown Towns takes on a deeper meaning. It is not only about where people were told they could not stay, but about what they were prevented from building. The loss of opportunity echoes across generations, shaping futures that might have been different under fairer conditions. Understanding this legacy requires looking beyond individual towns and seeing the broader pattern they created. It is a reminder that the consequences of exclusion do not disappear when practices change their form. They endure, carried forward in lives shaped by limits that were imposed long before many were born. As this story reaches its closing chapter, one truth stands out with unmistakable clarity. The legacy of Sundown Towns does not fade on its own. Silence does not erase history, and time alone does not heal what was never fully acknowledged. What does create change is awareness, the willingness to see these patterns for what they are, to understand how they were built, and to recognize how they continue to shape lives long after the original rules disappeared. Historical education is not about reopening old wounds for the sake of blame. It is about understanding cause and effect. When we learn how exclusion was normalized, enforced, and passed down through generations, we begin to see that today's inequalities did not appear randomly. They were designed, reinforced, and protected by systems that favored some while restricting others. Education gives us the language to name these realities and the clarity to challenge them honestly. Without that understanding, progress becomes shallow, built on good intentions rather than meaningful change. Awareness also changes how communities see themselves. When towns confront their past instead of avoiding it, they open the door to transformation. Acknowledging history creates space for dialogue, accountability, and growth. It allows residents to decide what kind of future they want to represent, not one defined by fear or exclusion, but by openness and fairness. Inclusivity is not a loss of identity, it is an expansion of it. Communities that choose belonging over division often discover strength they never knew they had. Active efforts toward inclusivity are what turn understanding into action. This means fair housing practices that truly welcome diversity, local leadership that listens rather than dismisses, and everyday choices that reject quiet discrimination. It also means creating environments where people do not have to question their safety or worth based on where they are or how they look. When inclusivity becomes intentional, it reshapes not just policies, but culture, trust, and opportunity. For individuals, awareness offers something equally powerful: freedom, the freedom to move without fear, to pursue opportunity without hesitation, and to exist without constantly measuring risk. That freedom grows when stories are shared, when experiences are validated, and when history is remembered accurately rather than conveniently forgotten. Each conversation pushes back against the silence that once allowed exclusion to thrive unnoticed. As we step away from this story, the goal is not despair, but responsibility. Understanding the legacy of Sundown Towns gives us the chance to ensure they remain part of history, not the present, a future built on safety, equality, and belonging is possible, but only if it is pursued deliberately, with honesty and commitment. Thank you for taking the time to watch and reflect on this story. If you found this video meaningful or informative, please like, subscribe, and share it with others who believe that understanding the past is essential to shaping a better future. Your support helps keep these conversations alive and helps ensure that stories like this are never forgotten again.